Good morning, General Brooks. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom so cleanly that every sound disappeared at once. The attorneys stopped writing. The bailiff froze beside the evidence table. My daughter Claire, sitting 3 rows behind me, inhaled sharply enough that I could hear it across the room. And my sister-in-law, Victoria Brooks, the woman who had spent the last 3 months telling everyone I was a lonely widow trying to steal her brother's legacy, simply stared at me. Her expression shifted from confidence to confusion, then from confusion to something I had seen hundreds of times during my years in military courtrooms. Fear. General? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I folded my hands calmly on the table in front of me. After 25 years serving in military law, I had learned something important. The loudest person in any courtroom is usually the least prepared. Victoria had been loud for months. 3 months earlier, I was standing in my kitchen when the certified letter arrived. The first snow of March was melting across the foothills outside Colorado Springs, leaving thin ribbons of water running through the fields behind our ranch. I remember because Daniel always loved that time of year. He used to say the mountains looked honest when winter finally let go. The house felt painfully quiet without him. For 32 years, we had built a life together on that land beneath the Rockies. We raised our daughter there, we buried our dogs there, we watched sunsets from the same weathered porch swing every summer. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I was alone. I opened the envelope at the kitchen counter while coffee brewed beside me. At first, I thought it might be another sympathy card or insurance document. Instead, I found legal papers. Petition for estate review. Allegation of undue influence. Request for transfer of ownership. I sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt colder. This wasn't about money, not really. It was about the ranch. Victoria wanted the ranch. Our ranch. The place where Daniel had rebuilt fences with his own hands. The place where he taught our grandchildren to ride horses. The place where he spent his final months after cancer stole nearly everything else from him. According to the petition, I had manipulated my husband during his illness and convinced him to leave the property to me. I read those words 3 times before setting the papers down. Then I laughed quietly to myself. Not because anything about it was funny, because betrayal becomes strangely predictable after a certain age, especially when grief and inheritance enter the same room. Victoria had always struggled with boundaries. Even when Daniel was healthy, she treated his life as if it belonged partly to her. She had opinions about our vacations, our finances, our parenting decisions, and eventually his medical care. During the final year of his illness, she called constantly. She questioned every treatment plan, every doctor, every choice we made together. When Daniel asked for peace, she called me controlling. When he asked for privacy, she accused me of isolating him. And now she wanted the one place he had loved most in the world. The ranch had been in the Brooks family for generations, and Victoria believed that bloodlines mattered more than marriage vows. In her mind, I was temporary, even after 32 years. You should settle. Claire told me that evening as we sat at the kitchen table watching snow fall beyond the windows. My daughter looked exhausted. Divorce had aged her faster than motherhood ever could. Between raising 2 children alone and working long shifts at the hospital billing office, she carried more weight than anyone should. Mom, Aunt Victoria has money. Connections. Lawyers. I stirred my tea slowly. I know. Claire hesitated before speaking again. I just don't want you going through this alone. I looked around the kitchen Daniel and I had remodeled together 10 years earlier. The copper pans hanging over the stove, the framed family photos, the old wooden table scarred by decades of birthdays, homework sessions, and holiday dinners. I'm not alone, I said quietly. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Dad's gone. I reached across the table and took her hand. That's not what I mean. The truth was, most people didn't know who I had been before retirement. Even Claire knew only fragments. Daniel and I had agreed years ago to keep my career separate from family life. Not secret exactly, just private. After decades of military investigations, overseas tribunals, and courtrooms where people's futures were decided in a matter of minutes, I wanted peace. I wanted gardens and horses and coffee on the porch. I wanted to stop being General Eleanor Brooks and simply become Daniel's wife. Later, I wanted to become his widow. But grief has a way of reopening doors you thought you had closed forever. A week after the lawsuit arrived, Victoria invited the family to dinner. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Victoria never hosted gatherings unless she wanted an audience. Her home overlooked the city lights from the northern edge of Colorado Springs, all polished stone floors and expensive artwork. The kind of house designed to impress visitors rather than comfort them. The moment I walked inside, I felt it. The performance had already begun. Daniel's cousin Mark barely looked at me. His wife, Elaine, offered one of those tight smiles people use when they want credit for being polite. Dinner moved slowly through awkward conversations and carefully disguised insults. "You must be worried about legal expenses," Victoria said casually while pouring wine. "I'm managing," she smiled. "Well, these situations can become expensive quickly." Across the table, Mark nodded. "Daniel always talked about keeping the ranch in the family." I looked directly at him. I was his family. The room fell silent for a moment before Victoria leaned back in her chair. "You know what your problem is, Eleanor?" I waited. "You always acted like you knew better than everyone else." Claire lowered her eyes toward her plate. "Victoria," she said quietly. But her aunt ignored her. "You lived on that ranch because my brother built it. You had a nice life because of him." She took a sip of wine. "At the end of the day, you were just a homemaker." That hurt more than I expected. Not because I was ashamed of the years I spent raising our family. I was proud of them. It hurt because Daniel had never seen me that way. He understood sacrifice. He respected the parts of my life I rarely talked about. The nights I woke from old memories, the friends I buried, the responsibility I carried for decades. He knew exactly who I was, and now he was gone. I set my fork down carefully and looked at Victoria. "I'll see you in court," she smiled confidently. "You won't last 5 minutes." That night, after Claire left, I sat alone on the porch wrapped in Daniel's old wool jacket while the wind moved through the pine trees. I thought about the oath I took decades earlier. I thought about the young airmen I had defended and the guilty officers I had prosecuted. I thought about all the people who underestimated me because I spoke softly and listened more than I talked. Then I walked upstairs to our bedroom and opened the cedar chest in the back of the closet. Inside sat the pieces of a life I had packed away years ago. My service records, my commission papers, photographs from overseas assignments. And resting carefully on top, the silver star insignia I hadn't touched since my retirement ceremony. I held it in my hand for a long time, not with anger, not with resentment, with certainty, because for the first time since Daniel died, I remembered something important. Victoria Brooks had mistaken my silence for weakness, and that was going to be the biggest mistake of her life. The morning after I opened the cedar chest, I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. Old habits survive long after uniforms are packed away. For 25 years, my body learned to recognize pressure before my mind did. Important hearings, overseas deployments, difficult conversations with commanders, my eyes always opened before dawn on those days. Apparently, being sued by your late husband's sister was no different. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the first light settle across the foothills beyond the ranch. Fresh snow covered the fence lines Daniel had repaired the previous autumn, just weeks before his strength finally gave out. He had insisted on doing the work himself despite the chemotherapy, stopping every few minutes to catch his breath. I remembered asking him why he pushed himself so hard. He had smiled and said, "Because I want things to be ready for you." At the time, I thought he meant the ranch. Now I understood he meant much more than that. Grief changes shape over time. At first, it feels like drowning. Then it becomes a weight you learn to carry. Some mornings, it sits quietly beside you. Other mornings, it wakes up before you do. That morning, it sat across from me at the kitchen table while I drank my coffee alone. Around 9 o'clock, Claire arrived unexpectedly with cinnamon rolls from the bakery Daniel loved. She set the box on the counter and hugged me tightly. Since her father died, she hugged me differently, longer. Like she was afraid I might disappear too. "I barely slept," she admitted. "Me neither." She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room the way people do when they're trying to imagine life after loss. "I still expect Dad to walk through that door," she said quietly. "So do I." We sat in silence for a while. At our age, silence doesn't always need filling. Eventually, she looked up at me. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Why didn't you ever tell me more about your career?" I smiled faintly. "I had expected that question eventually. You knew I served in the Air Force. I knew you worked in military law." She shook her head. "I didn't know enough to understand who you really were." I looked down at my coffee cup. The truth was complicated. Children don't always see their parents as people. They see functions. Mothers cook meals, drive to soccer practice, remember birthdays, and make sure everyone else is okay. The lives we lived before they existed often seem impossible to them. When you were little, I wanted you to have a normal childhood, I said finally. After everything I saw during my career, normal felt important. Claire nodded slowly. Dad knew everything? Everything. She smiled through tears. He must have been proud of you. I looked toward the mountains outside the window. He was. But he never treated my career like the most important thing about me. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with Daniel. When we met, I was a captain stationed at Peterson Air Force Base. He owned a small construction company and had absolutely no interest in military rank or titles. On our third date, I told him I was an attorney. On our fourth, I told him I prosecuted military crimes. He simply nodded and asked if I wanted dessert. Years later, he told me that was the moment he knew he wanted to marry me. Not because of my career, but because he realized how hard I worked to leave it at the office. Around noon, Claire left to pick up the children from school, and I spent the afternoon walking through the barn. Daniel's work gloves still hung beside the tool bench. His old radio sat exactly where he left it. Love leaves fingerprints everywhere if you know where to look. I was carrying a box of old photographs back toward the house when my phone rang. Victoria. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello, Victoria. Her voice arrived polished and confident. Eleanor. I wanted to discuss this situation before things become unpleasant. I almost smiled. That was Victoria's favorite tactic. Frame conflict as concern. It's already unpleasant. She ignored the comment. You know, Daniel would have wanted the ranch to stay in the Brooks family. I looked out toward the pasture where our grandson learned to ride horses last summer. It is staying in the Brooks family. Her tone sharpened immediately. You know what I mean? Yes, I did. In Victoria's mind, marriage certificates expired when death certificates arrived. Daniel made his wishes clear. She laughed softly. According to you. There it was. The accusation beneath every conversation we'd had for the past year. She believed I had manipulated her brother. Not because there was evidence. Because the alternative required accepting that Daniel chose differently than she wanted him to. I'll see you in court, Victoria. Her voice turned cold. You really think you can win this? I remembered standing before 3-star generals half my life ago. I remembered prosecuting cases where entire careers hung in the balance. I remembered young airmen placing their futures in my hands. Yes, I said simply. There was a long silence on the other end. Then she said something that surprised me. You always thought you were better than us. I closed my eyes briefly. No, I just loved your brother. After I hung up, I stood alone in the barn for several minutes thinking about that sentence. People often confuse boundaries with arrogance, especially people who benefit from having none. Victoria had spent most of her life believing access equaled ownership. Daniel's time, Daniel's attention, Daniel's decisions. She never understood that love cannot be controlled. During the final months of his illness, that misunderstanding became impossible to ignore. Every time he chose peace over family gatherings, she blamed me. Every time he declined another conversation about the ranch, she accused me of influencing him. But cancer changes priorities. When time becomes limited, people stop pretending. Daniel didn't want conflict. He wanted mornings on the porch, football games with our grandchildren, and evenings watching the sunset over the mountains. He wanted ordinary things. The problem was that ordinary things become priceless when you're running out of time. That evening, Claire called again. Mom, Aunt Victoria invited everyone to dinner on Sunday. I leaned back in my chair. Of course she did. You don't have to go. I thought about that for a moment. Part of me wanted to avoid the entire family. Another part recognized exactly what Victoria was doing. She wanted an audience. She wanted to isolate me. She wanted everyone to see me as the outsider before the legal battle even began. I'll be there, I said. Claire sighed. She's going to try to provoke you. I looked down at the folder sitting on my kitchen table. The lawsuit papers remained exactly where I left them. That's okay. Mom, I'm serious. So am I. Military court taught me something years ago. People reveal themselves when they think they've already won. Victoria believed I was a grieving widow with no experience fighting back. She believed age had made me fragile. She believed kindness meant weakness. Most importantly, she believed she knew everything about me. That was the advantage of living quietly for so many years. People stop asking questions. They create stories instead. The next morning, I drove into town and met with the ranch's accountant. Then I reviewed the documents Daniel and I had organized during his illness. Trusts, Property records, medical directives, letters. Everything was exactly where he said it would be. Daniel had prepared carefully, not because he expected to die, but because he loved me enough to protect me if he did. Late that afternoon, I unlocked the small filing cabinet in my home office and removed a thin leather folder I hadn't opened in years. Unlike the lawsuit Victoria filed, my folder wasn't thick. Experience taught me that the strongest cases rarely required dramatic presentations, just facts. Organized, verified, and impossible to dispute. As I placed the folder on my desk, my eyes drifted toward the framed photograph beside my computer. It showed Daniel and me standing in front of the ranch on our 30th anniversary. He had one arm around my shoulders and that familiar smile that always made me feel safe. I touched the edge of the frame gently. "I promised I'd protect this place," I whispered. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the fields. For the first time since Daniel died, I didn't feel lost. I felt focused, and somewhere deep inside, a part of myself I had buried years ago was beginning to wake up. By the time Sunday dinner arrived, I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to hire an attorney. Not yet. For 3 decades, I had watched people spend small fortunes paying others to say things they could have said themselves if they understood the law, the facts, and most importantly, the truth. Victoria believed her advantage came from money and influence. She had no idea that I had spent 25 years building my career around dismantling advantages exactly like those. The invitation had arrived by text 2 days earlier, short and polite in the way messages often become when they hide less polite intentions. "Family dinner. 6 o'clock. Hope you can make it." Claire offered to skip it altogether. I understood why. She had inherited Daniel's dislike for confrontation. But I knew avoiding the dinner would only strengthen Victoria's narrative. Inheritance disputes aren't won only in courtrooms. They're fought in living rooms, over dining tables, and inside the stories families tell about one another. If Victoria succeeded in painting me as the outsider before the case even began, every legal victory afterward would feel hollow. So at 5:30 that evening, I drove across town toward her house. Colorado Springs looked beautiful beneath the fading light. The mountains glowed orange against the winter sky. And for a moment I found myself remembering the first time Daniel drove me through these streets nearly 33 years earlier. I had just returned from an overseas assignment, and still carried the restless energy of someone who didn't know how to stop moving. Daniel pointed toward the mountains and said, "One day, you'll learn to slow down here." I laughed at him then. Somehow, he turned out to be right. Victoria's house sat high above the city in one of those neighborhoods, where every lawn looked professionally maintained, and every driveway held a luxury SUV. Claire met me outside before we went in. "You sure you're okay?" she asked quietly. "I've handled tougher rooms than this." She looked at me curiously. "You always say things like that." I smiled faintly. Occupational habit. The front door opened before we reached it. Victoria greeted us with the same carefully rehearsed smile she had worn at Daniel's funeral. Warm enough to appear gracious, cold enough to create distance. "Eleanor, Claire. I'm glad you could make it." The house was already full. Daniel's cousin Mark stood near the fireplace talking to his wife, Elaine. 2 of Victoria's friends from her country club sat in the living room pretending not to stare at me. I recognized what she was doing immediately. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a jury selection. Every person in that room had been invited to witness the role she had written for me. The grieving widow, the emotional outsider, the woman who had somehow taken what belonged to the Brooks family. During dinner, the conversation stayed comfortably superficial at first. Weather, politics, the local economy. Claire did her best to keep things neutral, but Victoria had no interest in neutrality. She wanted conflict. She just wanted me to start it. Halfway through the meal, she set down her wine glass and looked directly at me. "I've been thinking a lot about Daniel lately." I nodded. "So have I," she smiled sadly. "He loved that ranch so much." There it was, the opening move. He did. Mark leaned forward. Hard to imagine anyone else owning it. Claire stiffened beside me. I took another sip of water. Fortunately, Daniel made sure we won't have to imagine. Victoria's expression tightened. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." One of her friends shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even she could feel the tension building. Victoria folded her hands carefully. "You know, Eleanor, I still don't understand why Daniel handled everything the way he did." I met her eyes calmly. "You'd have to ask him." "I can't." Her voice sharpened. "That's exactly the problem. The room fell silent. Grief sat heavily between us, but not all grief looks the same. Mine was quiet. Hers demanded answers. Mine wanted peace. Hers wanted control. Victoria, Claire said softly, please. But Victoria continued. My brother spent his final months isolated from his family. I set my fork down slowly. Daniel wasn't isolated. We barely saw him. Because he was dying. The words landed harder than I intended. Victoria looked away for a moment before recovering. You always had an answer. No, I said quietly. I just listened when he spoke. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe everyone made mistakes. I almost smiled. Families love that phrase when accountability becomes uncomfortable. Everyone made mistakes. As though responsibility becomes lighter when spread evenly enough. Victoria leaned back in her chair. I just think people change when they're vulnerable. There it was. The accusation beneath every conversation since Daniel's diagnosis. She believed I had manipulated him. Not because she had evidence, but because believing otherwise would force her to accept that her brother made choices she didn't like. Daniel didn't change, I said calmly. His priorities did. Victoria shook her head. You always thought you knew what was best for him. Claire looked down at her plate. I could see tears forming in her eyes. She hated conflict, especially between people she loved. I reached over and touched her hand briefly before looking back at Victoria. No, I respected what he wanted, even when it hurt. Victoria laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. You know what your problem is? I waited. You think you're smarter than everyone else. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably. Nobody defended me. Nobody challenged her. That was another lesson life teaches you after 50. Silence often reveals loyalties more clearly than words. Victoria continued. You spent most of your life hiding behind Daniel. I felt something unexpected then. Not anger. Sadness. Because she truly believed that. After 32 years of family holidays, birthdays, vacations, and Sunday dinners, she still didn't know who I was. At the end of the day, she said, You were just a homemaker living on my brother's land. Claire's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up abruptly. That's enough. Victoria looked surprised. I'm only telling the truth. I glanced at my daughter. Her face looked flushed with anger. For so many years, she had seen me absorb difficult moments quietly. Now she was seeing the cost of that silence. I squeezed her hand gently, asking her without words to sit back down. She hesitated before doing so. Then I looked at Victoria. You know what's interesting? I asked softly. She crossed her arms. What? You've known me for 32 years, and you've never once asked who I was before I married your brother. Something flickered across her face. Confusion, maybe. Or discomfort. Before she could respond, I stood and picked up my coat. Thank you for dinner. Victoria blinked. That's it? I nodded. That's it. As Claire and I walked toward the front door, Victoria called after me. You really think you can win this? I turned back and looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the courtrooms I'd stood in overseas. The investigations that lasted years. The lives changed by a single decision. The young officers who trusted me to defend them fairly. I don't need to win, Victoria, I said quietly. I just need the truth. Her expression hardened immediately. The truth won't save you. I almost smiled. If there was one thing my career had taught me, it was this. People who fear the truth usually underestimate its power. Claire and I drove back to the ranch mostly in silence. The mountains stood dark against the night sky, and the familiar road home felt steadier somehow. Halfway there, Claire finally spoke. Mom, who were you before you married Dad? I looked out the window for a moment. For years, I had avoided answering that question fully. Not because I was ashamed, because some chapters of your life become too heavy to carry into peaceful years. But peace had ended the moment Victoria filed that lawsuit. I think it's time I showed you, I said quietly. When we reached the ranch, I led Claire upstairs to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the back of the closet. Inside rested my service records, photographs from deployments, commendation medals, and the Silver Star insignia I hadn't worn in years. Claire stared at them in silence. Then she picked up a framed photograph of me standing beside a courtroom podium in full dress uniform. Mom, she whispered, who exactly were you? I looked at the woman in the photograph, the straight posture, the determined expression, the eyes that had already seen too much. For the first time in years, I answered honestly. I was Brigadier General Eleanor Brooks, I said. And I spent 25 years making sure powerful people couldn't rewrite the truth. The morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn. For a few seconds, lying in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, I forgot why my chest felt heavy. Then I turned toward Daniel's side of the bed and remembered. Grief works that way. It gives you small moments of mercy before handing reality back to you. I sat up slowly and looked out the window toward the eastern horizon. The first light of day was beginning to touch the peaks beyond the ranch. Daniel used to say the mountains look strongest before sunrise because they didn't need anyone watching to stand tall. I understood what he meant now. I dressed simply that morning. Gray slacks, a navy blouse, a dark wool coat, nothing expensive, nothing designed to impress anyone. After 25 years in military courtrooms, I had learned that people who rely on appearances often underestimate those who don't. I tied my silver-streaked hair back neatly and glanced at myself in the mirror. At 58, I looked exactly like what Victoria expected me to be. A grieving widow, a grandmother, a woman who spent most of her life raising a family and tending a ranch. Perfect. Downstairs, I poured myself a cup of black coffee and picked up the leather folder waiting on the kitchen table. It wasn't thick. Experience taught me long ago that strong cases rarely require mountains of paperwork. They require facts, organized carefully, and presented with discipline. Daniel understood that, too. Before he died, he had helped me prepare every document I would need, not because he expected a legal battle, because he knew his sister better than I wanted to admit. At 7:30, Claire arrived carrying 2 coffees and enough nervous energy for both of us. She stepped into the kitchen and studied me carefully. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked. "A little." She handed me the coffee. "I'm terrified." I smiled faintly. "That's because you've never spent much time in courtrooms." She shook her head. "You don't seem nervous at all." I looked out the window toward the mountains. "I am nervous." She frowned. "You don't look it. There's a difference." We drove downtown in silence. Colorado Springs moved through its usual morning routine around us. Parents dropping children off at school. Construction crews gathering near job sites. Runners moving through city parks. Ordinary life continuing while ours felt suspended. Claire finally broke the silence as we pulled into the courthouse parking lot. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked straight ahead. "Why didn't you ever tell me your rank?" I thought about the question for a moment. Because after I retired, I didn't want people treating me differently. She turned toward me. "But it matters." I smiled sadly. "Only if you let it." The courthouse stood at the edge of downtown, a solid stone building with tall windows and broad steps leading to the entrance. The kind of place designed to remind people that institutions outlast individuals. As we climbed the stairs, I felt something settle inside me. Familiarity. Courtrooms had always made sense to me. Families rarely did. Family conflicts are driven by emotion. Legal conflicts are driven by procedure. Procedures can be managed. Emotions are much harder to control. We stepped through security and entered the main lobby. Victoria was already there, exactly as I expected. She stood near the elevators wearing a cream-colored designer suit, her dark hair perfectly styled, surrounded by 3 attorneys carrying thick trial binders. Mark stood beside her, looking uncomfortable. The moment she saw me, her expression shifted into that polished smile she reserved for public performances. "Eleanor," she called loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm glad you came." I walked toward her calmly with Claire at my side. One of the attorneys glanced around me, clearly expecting legal counsel to appear. When he realized I was alone, his expression changed slightly. Predators recognize isolation. "You don't have a lawyer?" Victoria asked. "No." She exchanged a quick look with her lead attorney before turning back to me. "That's brave." I almost smiled. After all these years, she still mistook simplicity for vulnerability. "I've handled difficult situations before." Victoria stepped closer. Her perfume was expensive and familiar. She had worn the same scent for years. "You should have accepted my offer," she said quietly. "This doesn't have to become ugly." I met her eyes evenly. "It already is." Her smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake." I thought about correcting her. I thought about telling her exactly who she was speaking to. Instead, I simply said, "We'll let the court decide that." We entered the courtroom a few minutes later. It was smaller than I expected. Old wooden benches lined the back wall. The American flag stood beside the judge's bench. Sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating particles of dust floating through the air. I sat alone at the defense table while Victoria's legal team spread documents across theirs like they were preparing for a corporate merger instead of a family dispute. Claire squeezed my shoulder before taking a seat behind me. "Are you sure you're okay?" she whispered. I nodded once. The truth was, I felt calmer than I had in months. The bailiff called the room to order promptly at 9 o'clock. Everyone rose as Judge Thomas Mercer entered carrying a case file beneath one arm. He appeared to be in his late 60s with close-cropped gray hair and the steady posture of someone who had spent years in uniform. The moment I saw him, I recognized him immediately. We had served together nearly 20 years earlier during a joint legal review at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, but military legal circles are small, especially at senior levels. Judge Mercer settled into his chair and scanned the courtroom briefly. Then his eyes landed on me. He stopped. For a moment, his expression remained unreadable. Then recognition spread across his face. Surprise followed. Finally, respect. Victoria's lead attorney stood and began presenting the case. His voice carried the polished confidence of a man accustomed to winning. He described me as a grieving widow who had allegedly exerted undue influence over her terminally ill husband. He referred to Victoria as a devoted sister seeking to preserve family legacy. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, carefully constructing a narrative designed to make me appear manipulative and emotionally unstable. I listened quietly, making occasional notes. Across the room, Victoria sat perfectly still, convinced the outcome was inevitable. When the attorney finished, Judge Mercer looked down at the file in front of him, then back at me. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "will you be representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." He studied me for another second before standing slightly straighter in his chair. The room fell silent. Then he gave a small nod. "Good morning, General Brooks." Every sound disappeared. The court reporter stopped typing. One of the attorneys lowered his pen. Claire inhaled sharply behind me. Victoria stared at me as though she had never seen me before. "General?" she repeated quietly. Judge Mercer looked mildly surprised by her confusion. "Retired Brigadier General Eleanor Brooks," he said evenly. "Former senior attorney with the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Victoria's face lost its color so quickly it startled me. The lead attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware Mrs. Brooks had legal experience." Judge Mercer held his gaze for a moment. That would be a considerable understatement. I folded my hands calmly on the table in front of me. Across the room, I watched realization spread through Victoria's expression one painful layer at a time. Confusion, shock, embarrassment, and finally, fear. Because for the first time since Daniel died, she understood something I had known all along. She hadn't brought a grieving widow into a courtroom. She had brought me back into one. Nobody moved for several seconds after Judge Mercer called me General Brooks. Silence settled over the courtroom with a weight I recognized immediately. I had witnessed that exact silence dozens of times throughout my career. It was the sound people made when a story they believed suddenly stopped making sense. Victoria stared at me from across the room, her mouth slightly open, her confidence draining away one heartbeat at a time. Claire sat frozen behind me, her eyes wide with disbelief. I understood her reaction. The night before, I had shown her photographs and medals. But hearing a federal judge publicly acknowledge who I had once been was different. Titles carry a strange kind of power, especially when they come from someone else. Judge Mercer adjusted his glasses and looked back down at the file in front of him. "Mrs. Brooks," he corrected himself gently. "General Brooks, I assume you still intend to represent yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Victoria's lead attorney shifted uncomfortably. The polished certainty in his voice had vanished. "Your Honor, while General Brooks's military background is certainly impressive, we believe it has no bearing on the facts of this case." Judge Mercer nodded slightly. "You're correct. Her rank is not evidence." He paused briefly. "Her legal experience, however, may explain why she chose to appear without counsel." A few quiet laughs rippled through the courtroom before quickly fading. Victoria lowered her eyes. Embarrassment had replaced arrogance, but I knew better than to underestimate her. People who feel cornered often become reckless. The attorney resumed his presentation with noticeably less confidence than before. He repeated the same claims outlined in the petition. Daniel had been vulnerable during his illness. I had controlled access to him. I had influenced his decisions regarding the ranch. He spoke carefully now, choosing each word with greater caution. By the time he finished, the room felt different. The narrative Victoria had built over months no longer seemed so convincing. Judge Mercer turned toward me. "General Brooks, would you like to respond?" I stood slowly, carrying only a single folder to the podium. 25 years in military court taught me that preparation matters more than performance. "Yes, Your Honor." I looked toward Victoria's attorney. "You stated that I isolated my husband during his treatment. That is our position. Did you interview his oncologist?" He hesitated. "No." "Did you review hospice visitation records?" "No." "Did you speak with the home health care nurses who visited our ranch 3 times each week?" "No." I nodded once. "Did you interview my husband's physical therapist?" "No." I folded my hands calmly. "Then on what evidence do you base your allegation?" The attorney shifted his weight. "We have statements from family members. Family members who were asked by Daniel himself to reduce visits because he was exhausted from treatment?" His silence answered the question for him. I returned to my seat. That was another lesson military law teaches you. You don't need to destroy an argument. You only need to expose the empty space beneath it. Judge Mercer looked down at his notes. "General Brooks, do you have evidence to submit?" "Yes, Your Honor." I opened my folder and removed several copies of a document. The bailiff distributed them to the judge and opposing counsel. Victoria leaned toward her attorney, trying to read the pages upside down. "What is that?" she whispered. The attorney didn't answer immediately. His expression had already changed. "This is a notarized letter written and signed by my husband 8 months before his death," I explained. "It outlines his intentions regarding ownership of the ranch and addresses concerns he anticipated might arise after his passing." Judge Mercer read the first page carefully. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed him remove his glasses and reread a paragraph. That was never a bad sign. Finally, he looked up. The letter states, and I quote, "The ranch belongs to my wife, Eleanor. Any attempt to challenge her ownership would violate my explicit wishes." The courtroom remained silent. Victoria's face turned pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "No, it's simply inconvenient." Claire covered her mouth with one hand behind me. I hadn't shown her the letter before today. Not because I didn't trust her. Because I had learned long ago that timing matters almost as much as truth. Victoria leaned toward her attorney. "Why didn't we know about this?" The attorney's jaw tightened. "Did you know this document existed?" he asked quietly. Victoria looked away. He didn't need her answer. I could see it in his expression. She had withheld information. During my career, I saw that mistake more times than I could count. Clients rarely lie because they're evil. They lie because they believe controlling information will control outcomes. It never does. Judge Mercer set the letter aside. "Do you have additional evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor." I handed another set of documents to the bailiff. Exhibit B consists of email correspondence between Daniel Brooks and his sister over the final year of his life. Victoria sat straighter immediately. "Those emails are private." I met her eyes. "You made Daniel's final months a matter of public record when you accused me of manipulating him." Judge Mercer reviewed the document silently. The room remained still except for the sound of paper turning. Finally, he looked toward Victoria. "Mrs. Brooks, are these emails authentic?" Her attorney answered before she could. "We have no reason to dispute their authenticity at this time." The judge nodded and continued reading. His expression hardened slightly. Then he read aloud. "Victoria, I need you to stop asking about the ranch. I need my sister right now, not my estate planner." Claire lowered her head as tears filled her eyes. Judge Mercer turned another page. "If you continue discussing property during my treatment, I'll need to limit visits. I want peace with the time I have left." The courtroom grew even quieter. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat behind Victoria. One of her friends looked down at her hands. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with her anymore. Victoria shook her head slowly. He wasn't thinking clearly. I heard the words before I fully processed them. They struck me harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they revealed something painful. Victoria loved her brother deeply, but she only trusted his decisions when they aligned with her own desires. Judge Mercer looked at her evenly. "Your brother wrote these emails over several months. Do you have evidence questioning his mental capacity during that period?" Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. "Don't answer that." She looked at him in frustration. "But, don't answer." For the first time since this began, Victoria looked frightened. Not angry, frightened. because she finally understood what I had known from the beginning. Daniel had anticipated this conflict. He had prepared for it carefully, and he had trusted me to protect what mattered most to him. Judge Mercer turned back toward me. "General Brooks, is there anything else?" I paused briefly before opening the final section of my folder. "Yes, Your Honor." Across the room, Victoria's remaining confidence disappeared completely. "I have one final piece of evidence relevant to the allegations of coercion and undue influence." Judge Mercer raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." I looked toward Victoria for a moment. For the first time since Daniel died, I saw her exactly as she was. Not as a villain, not as an enemy. Just as a grieving woman whose fear had consumed her judgment. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I removed a small digital recorder from my folder and placed it carefully on the evidence table. Victoria's face lost all color. Her eyes widened with sudden recognition, because she remembered the phone calls. And she knew exactly what was coming next. Judge Mercer looked down at the digital recorder resting on the evidence table, then back at me. "General Brooks, please explain the relevance of this recording." I kept my voice steady. During Daniel's treatment, he became increasingly concerned about conversations regarding the ranch. At his request, I documented several phone calls in which he felt pressured to alter his estate plans. Across the courtroom, Victoria sat motionless. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered something urgently, but she barely seemed to hear him. Grief has a way of making people believe they can rewrite history. Evidence has a way of reminding them they cannot. Judge Mercer nodded toward the bailiff. "Play the recording." The room fell silent. Then Victoria's voice filled the courtroom. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. "Daniel, you need to think about the family legacy. The ranch belongs to the Brooks name." A brief pause followed before Daniel's voice answered. Even through the speakers, I could hear the exhaustion in him. The chemotherapy had weakened his body, but not his mind. "Eleanor is my family, Victoria." Another pause. Then her voice again. "You're sick. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly." I closed my eyes for a moment. Hearing his voice after all these months felt like losing him all over again. Around me, I heard quiet movement. Claire was crying softly behind me. Mark lowered his head into his hands. The recording continued. "Please stop," Daniel said quietly. "I want peace. I want time with my wife and my daughter. I don't want to talk about property anymore." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "The ranch belongs to Eleanor. It always will." Judge Mercer stopped the recording. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Victoria stared at the table in front of her. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked neither angry nor defensive. She looked devastated. Judge Mercer removed his glasses and folded his hands. "Mrs. Brooks, this court has now reviewed a notarized statement, authenticated email correspondence, and audio evidence demonstrating your brother's clear intentions regarding his estate." Victoria's attorney stood slowly. The confidence he carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. "Your Honor, my client would like to discuss a settlement." I almost smiled. 4 hours earlier, they wanted a fight. Now they wanted an exit. Judge Mercer looked toward me. "General Brooks?" I stood carefully. "No, Your Honor." Victoria turned toward me in disbelief. "What do you mean, no?" I met her eyes calmly. "Your brother already settled this matter before he died." The courtroom remained silent. Judge Mercer nodded once and reviewed his notes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of finality. "This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the validity of Daniel Brooks's estate plan and his clear intention that ownership of the ranch remains solely with his wife, Eleanor Brooks." Claire covered her face with both hands as tears rolled down her cheeks. Judge Mercer continued. "The petition contesting ownership is denied in full." Victoria closed her eyes. Her shoulders sagged as though she had been carrying something far heavier than legal documents. "Furthermore," the judge said firmly, "this court finds credible evidence that inappropriate pressure was placed upon the deceased during periods of significant medical vulnerability. While the court will not pursue additional sanctions at this time, let me be clear, grief does not justify coercion." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Judge Mercer looked directly at me. "The ranch remains the sole property of General Eleanor Brooks." Just like that, it was over. 32 years of love had survived one final test. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered near the front steps. Local news cameras waited beside the entrance, hoping for statements about the family dispute that had quietly become one of the city's most talked-about cases. I ignored them. Claire reached me first, wrapping her arms around me as she cried against my shoulder. "Dad protected you," she whispered. I held her tightly. "We protected each other." She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry I asked you to settle." I smiled softly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You were trying to protect me." She shook her head. "I didn't know how strong you were." I thought about that for a moment. Strength isn't what most people think it is. Across the plaza, Victoria stood alone beside the courthouse steps. Her attorney had already left. Mark spoke quietly with her for a moment before walking away. For the first time in months, nobody stood beside her. No audience, no allies, no performance. Just a grieving sister facing the consequences of her choices. I could have walked away. Part of me wanted to. But after decades in military courtrooms, I had learned something important. Justice and revenge are not the same thing. I crossed the plaza slowly until I stood beside her. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were red. Her hands trembled slightly. "You could make this worse for me," she said quietly. "Yes." She lowered her gaze to the ground. "Then why aren't you?" I looked toward the mountains rising beyond the city skyline. Daniel loved those mountains. He said they reminded him that strength didn't need to be loud. "Because your brother wouldn't want that." Tears filled her eyes instantly. "I thought you took him away from us." I shook my head gently. "No, Victoria. Cancer took him away from all of us." For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then she whispered the words I had waited months to hear. "I know he loved you." I nodded. "I know he loved you too." 3 months later, the ranch felt different. Not empty. Peaceful. There's a difference. Empty means something is missing. Peace means something has healed. The first snow of winter dusted the mountains while Claire and the children decorated the porch for Christmas. Laughter drifted through the yard as my grandson chased the dog through fresh snow near the fence line. Daniel rebuilt himself. I stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee, watching the sun set behind the Rockies. For the first time since Daniel died, the silence didn't hurt. It comforted me. Claire joined me on the porch and handed me an old photograph she had found while unpacking decorations. It showed me in dress uniform decades earlier, standing beside a courtroom podium overseas. "Grandma was a general?" my granddaughter asked excitedly. I smiled. "A long time ago." She studied the picture carefully. "Were you important?" Children ask honest questions because they expect honest answers. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I was useful." She smiled and ran back toward the house. Claire leaned against the porch railing beside me. "You know," she said softly, "I finally understand why Dad respected you so much." I looked out toward the mountains. "Your father understood something most people never learn." "What's that?" I smiled gently. "Titles disappear. Careers end. What matters is how we treat people when we have the power to hurt them." The cold evening air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind moved softly across the fields Daniel loved, and standing there, surrounded by the family we built together, I realized the ranch had never really been the inheritance he left me. His real legacy was simpler than that. Courage, kindness, loyalty. The reminder that love isn't measured by what we own but by what we protect. If this story touched you, share it with someone who has ever been underestimated because of their age, their quiet nature, or the sacrifices nobody saw them make. Leave a comment about a person in your life whose strength was hidden behind kindness. And if you believe dignity, resilience, and second chances still matter, stay with us for the next story.